Yes, roll call for Ms. Jessica Bueno, Mr. Regional Carrillo, Ms. Erika de la Rosa, Dr. Alicia Lin, and Ms. Carmen Trujillo. Thank you.
and that's the per pupil formula. All right, Mike, I don't know what you're doing, but that's not working. Good? Good? All right. Speakers off. All right, can you hear me now? Good? All right, so the per pupil formula. Per pupil formula, again, being covered by both local funds as well as state funds. And we are an equalized state. So I'm gonna give you my definition of being an equalized state because there isn't an official definition in statute, so you get my definition. It just means that we're providing equal funding for all students based on their need, regardless of where they go in Arizona. So a student who is autistic, regardless of whether they're here in Phoenix Elementary, they're over at Cartwright, they're down in Yuma, we're making sure that they have the same adequate funding to be able to provide for that student so they can get their education. And that's why we have an equalized formula to kind of balance that out. That's not the case in all states. Don't worry about memorizing this list. There's no test or Kahoot at the end. It's gonna make sure you know all these little acronyms. I put it into the slides just so you can keep it as your own cheat sheet if you're ever coming across these little letters and wondering what it stands for. But basically, these are all the different special education categories that we defined and assign extra funding to. So you can see the whole list up there. Even with some of the newer ones that have been passed in the last couple of years, such as gifted and also free and reduced price lunch. So those are a couple of the newer ones. Some of the other ones have been in for quite some time now. I'd say going back to the 80s for a lot of them. We used to have a kindergarten wait in there for full day kindergarten when Napolitano was in office, but that was in pretty quickly and out pretty quickly. So there's no more little K wait in there, but you see all the other different categories that are up there. Now, sometimes on reports, on these budget files that you receive that you guys are signing off on and approving, you're gonna see a little dash with an extension behind those letters. This is what those extensions stand for. So for instance, let's say if someone had an emotional disability and they were being privately placed, you would see ED-P, that would mean emotional disability, and the P would stand for private placement. So a lot of times it's the environment that they're in. All right, so now we're gonna get to like the genius of the formula, the reason why it's been around for 43 years and still just gets nibbled at the edges, doesn't get picked apart. It was actually a great formula back in the 80s when it was first put together. And it came up with one concept that's kind of at the core of our formula. First, when looking at how much funding to allocate for all students across Arizona, and you're looking at, you have some little kids, you have some big kids, they don't take up the same amount of space, they don't eat the same amount of food, you have small rural districts, you have large urban districts. I mean, obviously that has its own different challenges in there for both of them. You have your typical student, you have students who may have special needs, and you've got to come up with a formula system to pay for all of them, right? And to do it in a way that's adequate and fair. So to make it a little bit easier, I always like to use analogies. So we're gonna start with one right here. I also like to make them about food most of the time. So we're gonna make this one about pizza. Let's say we're ordering pizza for this room. We got to figure out how much pizza to order. All right, so first, let's say we start with Superintendent Hahiga, and she tells us she'll take one slice. Well, Mike Mike's probably got about an inch on me, I think. So Mike probably eats a little more than that. He's probably good for 2 slices. And Mike's got me on the height, but I got him on the depth. I think I'd go for 3 slices, right? So when you look at us, and if you were to use Superintendent Hahigat as like the base, like the average person in the room is gonna have 1 slice. Mike varies, I vary, 2 slices, 3 slices. All of a sudden we change to chicken strips. We would have to go through and resurvey everybody in the room once again and say, how many chicken strips would you like, right? We're heading over to Raising Cane's. We're gonna get those trays. We gotta figure out how many chicken strips. We would have to resurvey everyone when we change from pizza to chicken strips. But we don't have to do that when we use a weighted formula. And so essentially with the weighted formula, what we're saying is whatever Superintendent Hahigat is good with, Mike needs double that. I need triple, right? My needs are 3 times the typical need. Mike's needs are 2 times the typical need. And so now when we get a weighted count, Superintendent Hahigat counts for 1, Mike counts for 2, I count for 3. Our weighted count is 6. So when we're ordering pizza, we needed 6 slices of pizza. We're ordering chicken strips, we have to go to our typical and ask the superintendent, how many chicken strips would you like? She's gonna go for 3. That means Mike needs 6, I need 9, right? That's how the weighted count works. Whatever your typical need is, everybody else stems off of that. And so we have a base level that is set for your typical student in a typical environment. Everything else then gets weighted off of that. And so now when we go downtown every single year, nobody is arguing, you gotta increase funding for autistic students by $500 this year. No, you gotta increase funding for visually impaired students by $300 this year. No, you gotta take care of the hearing impaired students by $700 this year. Nobody has to argue for each individual category. We just fight for what happens to the base, because when the base increases, everybody increases. And we increase proportional with whatever our proportional amount was in determination to the base. Once in a great while, we'll do a special education cost study. So in the chicken strips example, I can't really finish 9 chicken strips. I mean, I love Cane's, their sauce is great. I'm not gonna make it through 9, right? Every now and then we do a cost study and we readjust the proportion. So in that case, we might find out that maybe I'm a 1.5 or a 2.5, but we'll make an adjustment to what my weight is in relation to the base. And that's how our formula works. That's the core of the formula, is you establish a base, everybody else stems off of the base based to their relational need to the base. All right, so let's talk about the mechanics on that. There's going to be 2 different types of mechanics on implementing these weights. One group is going to be your group A, and the other one is going to be your group B, because we were very creative when we came up with naming systems for how we're going to do this. But group A is basically a weight that's being applied to everyone. So when you're in a small school district, everyone at that school is part of a small school district. They're all going to get this extra weight that we want to give out for small school district settings, right? It's a weight that's going to go to everyone. Group B is, raise your hand if you fall in this category, we're going to count you, and we're going to see how many fall into that category, and we're going to give you extra money because you qualify for that category. So A, all, B, by the numbers. That's the best way we can go with an A and a B. All right, so we're going to go through some of the things that are in Group A. When this system first came on board, again, it was 1980, right? The good old years of the 1980, video games were popular, Pac-Man was reigning king. And back in 1980, there were no charter schools. There was no ESAs, there was no online schooling. As much your local school district had 95% of the community attending their school. The other 5% still went to private and parochial, and even homeschool, but 95% of the local community was right there in their local school district, right? That's what life looked like in 1980. And in 1980, they had just come off a major change on special education funding, where they really thought everybody was taking advantage of special education funding, right? And that was kind of like where they were with how things played out in the 70s. And so that influenced how the 1980 formula got put together. And their concern was over-identification, that you would say a student belongs to a special education category, just to get extra money. And so with that, they're like, well, how can we stop over-identification? And they go, well, there's certain categories that most students, you know, there's a high percentage of students that will fall into these categories, but we don't think that they're all conjugated in one area, right? They're not all collected in one area. They're evenly dispersed throughout the state. So when you look at some of these categories, like a specific learning disability and emotional disability, it isn't like everybody that has an emotional disability resides right here in Phoenix Elementary. They're kind of evenly spread across the state. All these different categories, these are the categories that have the greatest populations of special education students. And so their way to remedy not having this over-identification was to not treat them like a group B. Don't count them individually. Instead, treat it like a group A. And we're going to assume that everybody has this much of the population, the same amount of the population. And we're going to come up with, if that's 10% of your population, how much more do you need increase on all students to cover paying for that 10%? So that was the group A weight. They came up with 0.158 for your standard elementary district that has 600 or more students in the district, and 0.105 for your high school district that has 600 or more in the district. Worked fine back then. We're a different world today, but we haven't changed from what we did things back then. 912 students, bigger kids, bigger expenses. They threw them an extra base of 0.163, pushing the total group A weight for your typical high school district to 2.268, while your elementary is at 0.158. The small isolated school districts, those that have less than 600 in their total population, get an added weight on top of that on their group A weight. And this weight is then applied across all of your students within the district. So it's the A for all, gets applied to all of them. So let's say you're a charter school who says you're the best school system in the state, and you have nobody in any of these categories. You still get all of this funding because it's applied to all students. And that's the way our system works. So we're gonna look at those numbers. So this is a typical eighth grade student. Our base level right now is at $4,775.27. You multiply that by 1 to keep that number. You got 0.158 is your group A weight. And you can see that that adds on another $754, which means for your regular eighth grade student, you're getting just over $5,500 for that student. We're going to add a couple more things here in a bit. All right, now we get into our group Bs. And in our group Bs, you can see that the highest weight up there is MD SSI. And if you go back to your cheat sheet, you'll see that that's multiple disabilities with severe sensory impairment. These students are often wheelchair bound. It's our highest weighted category that you'll see. And then the lowest weight, it actually used to be this very popular weight down here that has the majority of special ed students, but now it's actually K3 reading at the 0.04. They made an adjustment to this weight, the DD, ED, MI, that was that group A category, all those ones that I said on the left that says they have an associated group B, and here's the reason why they made the adjustment. Originally, the only reason why a group B weight was created there was because they found out for a certain portion of this population, some of them needed to attend summer school or else they would have severe regression. And so they needed to have a count of how many are out there so that way we know how much summer school money to provide. They established that weight at 0.003, which yielded $10. So you get $10 for everybody in that category. And that combined of rolling up all that $10 together was supposed to be enough to pay for the summer school for the students who needed the summer school. When we got to greatest education system in the state, and I only say that because that's how the owner proclaims himself, and they didn't have anybody in that category, there was criticisms over how Group A is being applied. And that essentially Group A no longer follows the fundamental rules of why it was established back in 1980. And in a sense, it's lost its identity. It's just base funding at this point. And that those of us who have students in this category, we're then not receiving enough additional funding to be able to take care of students in that category. And so they increased that from a 0.003 up to a 0.292. So now we get more for that category. And this is exactly how much more that works out. So now, and this was recent, this is like the last handful of years. So now that 0.292 generates almost another $1,400 per student to address anyone that has those needs. So if you have someone who's in that category, their base support is $6,900. If at any time, ask a question, you got a question, I see a couple questions.
I just want to know, so the base pay is what the students are getting. Then all this other stuff, I get confused with group A, because group A is base pay, and B is also what base pay is.
So the 5,500, everybody's going to get that much. Everybody's going to get 5,500. They get 4,775.27 because that's the base level. They get the 0.158 because that was the extra money associated with Group A that now has lost its identity and really it just gets treated like base. And so this is your real base support per student is the 5,500. Going beyond that, if you have these special identified categories, you get additional funding on top of that. All of this funding, yes. And so that's the application of the Group B weight. I have one more example of a Group B weight. This one is the highest weighted category. So your MD SSI student will get $43,478. Again, it looks like a big number. When you actually see what it takes to provide support for a student who qualifies for that category, you'll find out that that number is not so big at all because usually you're upside down.
So the Group B is attached to the individual student.
It is part of the student's calculation for how much funding we're going to receive. None of the funding is actually attached to the student because it all gets rolled up into our revenue control limit that we can disperse between M&O and capital how we see fit. All right, so there's a couple of Group B examples. Any other questions on the weighting, how the weighting's playing out?
But it's,
Whoops.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
So, but Group B is given to us
Because of that
have
student.
this specific
Yes.
student who needs this, which, so I think that's like a problem that parents bring up, is
Yes.
that we have
Yes.
this student, you get this money because of the student, but you're not spending $43,000 on my student. Or maybe, I don't, but yeah,
That
If-
is, that is the claim. However,
I-
in most cases, we're
We
spending a
probably-
lot more than
but yes.
that.
So I've heard of backpack funding. We don't.
Yes.
it's not like that. Okay.
Well, we have backpack in the sense of if this student leaves your district and goes somewhere else, that $43,000 goes with them to that other district. So in the sense of backpack, the Graham Keegan style of it, where the money should follow the student, the money does follow the student. Wherever that student goes, their $43,000 goes with them. But in the sense of the money being tied back to the student, that if you generate X number of dollars off of me, I should receive that much in service. That isn't the case. Typically what ends up happening is it isn't the special education student that is underfunded. And especially ever since charters were invented, because it's now disproportionate where the special education students are, and there's more in school districts than there are in charters and to higher levels than there was before. What you see is it's the regular education student that's being shortchanged because a special education student has an individualized education plan that requires all of these services, and the amount of funding being received for them is not sufficient to cover the services. So you have to take money away from your regular education system to do that, which is why some people have adopted models, not districts, charters, to exclude special education students because they can run a more cost-effective model that way. All right, some additional provisions. We're not going to go into a ton of detail on these ones today, but we get transportation funding. I'm only going to point out two things about transportation funding. We have two numbers for transportation. One of them, very easy to explain, makes a lot of sense. We have a mileage rate, the number of miles you travel times the mileage rate gets you funding, right? That's our transportation support level. That one's very straightforward. Then we have a transportation revenue control limit, which is based on your historical changes for transportation. It never goes down, but it can go up. That one gets under attack a lot downtown. In the rural districts, what you'll find sometimes is that their transportation support level, which is funded by actual miles driven, may only be 10, 15,000, but their transportation revenue control limit might be 170,000. And so some people think that's not fair, but of course they haven't tried to drive a nice big bus over across a dirt road. it has potholes and falls apart with you in a few years. So that extra money that they get, it actually helps cover those buses for them because they don't have a lot of bond capacity out in those rural areas. Bonds, I'm not going to touch a ton on bonds tonight, but you get bond funding. I'll only say a couple of things about bonds. One is it is issuing of a debt, right? And the district has control over how that's structured, right? You control when you go out for an election, you control the structures of that. And I know that's an item for the next board meeting, so we'll go more into depth onto that one at that time. Overrides have some limitations to them. So you have 2 overrides. Technically, there's 3. The only reason why we still have to say there's 3 is because there's one district who refuses to get rid of the old one. So technically, there's 2 different types of M&O overrides. There's one that was called a K3. It made sense back in the day. Somebody won't get rid of it, so we can just take it out of statute. So there's really 2. It's M&O. You get 15% for M&O, right? And you get 10% for your capital override. Those numbers, when you think 15 and 10% of what? Of this, right? What this is calculating out to with your transportation funding is going to become what's called a revenue control limit, and you're getting an extra 10 to 15% on that. On M&O, you specifically call for the percentage, so you would say something like 15%, and it will be 15%, and as this number increases, it will increase with the 15%. On capital, you are calling for a dollar figure, and depending on the dollar figure that you call for, it may or may not be 10%. Coming from a growing district, I'll tell you, these last for 7 years, the capital override. I was in a growing district, so at the time, our revenue control limit justified $7.5 million for the capital override. That's what 10% equaled. So I called for 9.5 because I knew we'd grow into it. And so now every year it does stay at 10% because it just grows until it gets to the 9.5 and then it'll cap. So 10%, 15%, that's your extra on the overrides. Teacher experience index. This is an added benefit for having experienced teachers. If you are above the state average, you get extra funding. If you're below the state average, you don't get penalized. You just don't get the extra money. So above the state average generates more money. Depending on how far above the state average you are, you get even more. But if you're below, it's not a penalty, no harm, no foul. You just don't get the extra money allotted for teacher experience index. And then we have capital funding. So your capital funding right now generates you another $502.33. So we are very excited that that was finally increased last year, because prior to that, we were on the same number since the 1990s. And I'm sure everybody knows things cost a little bit more today than they did in the 1990s. But for historically, we were stuck on the 1990s number, and they finally started to inch that up a little bit. So we got 502. And the thought is that we will get another 2% increase on that in this session. So knock on wood. But we're hoping that we can keep that trend of that number inflating now. All right, on the next thing. So once you figure out how much money a district is entitled to for their student count based on their student needs, somebody's got to pay the bill, right? So we say that student that we had that was over 40,000, well, who's handing us the 40,000 to make sure we have it for that student? So there's a formula for that. And the way the formula is designed is how much the local taxpayers have to pay versus how much the state is going to kick in is based on your property values. If you are in a very affluent area, or you just have high property values in comparison to your student population, the local taxpayer pays everything. If you are in a low affluent area, the state picks up the majority of the cost of funding that. But everybody is working off the same qualifying tax rate that equals a qualifying levy. So that's how we keep that balance. And so basically, let's say that if you had a total number of 50 million, right? And as a state, we're saying, you know what? Everybody has to raise 10% of their own costs before we're going to kick in money. Now, for one district, 10% of their assessed values might come out to, okay, we got to raise, 10 million here locally first. So we're going to go ahead and raise 10 million and the state's going to give us 40. And then for a district that has high wealth, it may be, you know what, when we apply that rate, we can generate at the 10% level, we'll generate 100 million. Like we won't even come close to the 50 that we're limited to. They just have to tax for whatever it takes to get up to that rate. So then they would then run that tax. So that's how we figure out how much is going to come out from the state and the local. It's completely based on the assessed values of the district, where higher wealth, you're covering the majority of your costs, lower wealth, the state's picking up most of the tab. The state does not fund anything towards the higher transportation number that we refer to as the trickle, the transportation revenue control limit. They only fund for the transportation support level. So that difference between the two, that is picked up by local property tax. For the feds, for the feds, on the per pupil formula, only the impact aid districts have the ability to take some federal money and use it to buy down their tax rate. So if you go anywhere towards like Navajo Nation and you're looking at some of those districts, a lot of them will have a zero tax rate where they don't tax anything for property. And that's because they've used their federal impact aid to buy that tax rate down to zero and keep a zero tax rate. Some of that property is not taxable anyway, so they have a lot of sovereignty out there. But you have things like your utility lines, your centrally assessed things, all the power and stuff that's running through there, that is taxable property. They'll buy that down to zero and not even make APS or anybody else pay taxes. Or TUEA is actually the electric out there. Local pays whatever's left, right? So after the state has decided we're going to put in this much money towards what you guys are entitled to, local picks up the tab for what's left. So they'll come up with a number based on their formula. This is how much we're putting in. You guys are picking up the balance, whatever's left on that. So that includes all your overrides, your bonds, everything else. The difference between the TISL and the trickle, all that goes back to local after the states already capped themselves out. Now, in some areas, that makes the local tax get so high, and especially when we had desegregation on primary, what we would see is a lot of local taxes then would get extremely high. And we have a cap in our Constitution that you can't tax someone for more than 1% of their assessed value. And that's all the jurisdictions combined. That's your fire, county, everybody's city. When everybody's taxes are added up, you can't tax them on a primary assessed. You can't tax them for more than 1%. So all of us put our taxes together and boom, all of a sudden it's a huge tax bill for someone. And they say, nope, we're cutting off of the 1%. And everybody else, all you taxing jurisdictions, you're not getting anything more than that. That leaves us in a bind, right? Because then we're like, well, wait a second. Well, we needed this money that was promised through us through this formula. And if you guys aren't giving it to us, if we're not getting it from the local property tax, where are we going to get it from? That's where additional state aid kicks in. If we get capped like that, the state kicks in the extra money to cover the rest of the tab from that point. All right. So that's getting all of the money out to the district. Before I move into the next area, any questions on how we figure out how much money we're getting and how it's gonna get out to us? Who's gonna actually pay us for all this money that we're entitled to? When we look at the money that we're entitled to, we refer to that as budget capacity, and then the cash is just cash. All right. So we will say cash. Yes.
Teacher index.
Absolutely. Oops. All right. So teacher experience index. If you take all the teachers in the state, and let's say the average years of experience for a teacher in this state is maybe 9.2 years of experience. And then you compare that to the district's teachers, and their average years of experience is 8.5. They're below the average for the state. They get no additional funding. But let's say their average experience is 10. Now they do get a multiplier on top of their number for additional funding. And that's to compensate for the fact that you have high teacher experience. The thought is that more experienced teachers cost more. We should be incentivizing people to have more experienced teachers, and so they have the formula funding to give out more money when someone has more experienced teachers. Some of your highest rates are going to be out in the rural areas where the teacher's been teaching forever and their average experience is way up there. They get really high teacher experience indexes that are multiplying that. The other thing about the formula, after 15 years, it caps. So let's say you only had 3 teachers, and when I was at the state, we actually saw one that I don't know. I know they had to be lying on the data because it said that the teacher was teaching for 99 years. I'm like, there's no way they taught for 99 years. I'm like, what did they start teaching when they were 4? But it caps at 15. So after you have 15 years of experience, a teacher with 99 years of experience, or a teacher with 15 years of experience, they both count as 15 when you run them through the formula. Over 15, it doesn't count. It doesn't count towards your average.
So how much do they give us for that?
It's going to vary depending on how much over you are. On the high end, I've seen some of the rural districts get, 7-8% more funding for their experienced teachers. More commonly, I see 1.5-2% more funding. If you're talking Metro Phoenix, 1.5-2% for some of the districts out here, like the East Valley ones that have a little bit more experienced teachers, they're getting like another 1.5-2%.
Was desegregation listed under local?
No, I wasn't going to go too in depth into desegregation. The one thing I'll say about desegregation is, I'll just give you a quick overview on it. So desegregation all comes from the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So anybody who was found to be segregating then got served a desegregation order. Districts at that time said, well, how are we supposed to do all this? It's going to take money to be able to do all this, everything you're asking us to do. And so the desegregation funding formula was then created. It used to be based on per pupil. It would increase from year to year. But then they came along, and it's been under a lot of attacks the last decade and a half. The first thing they started to do was to cap it. They capped it per student, but districts were increasing on student counts. So that didn't work. So then they just did an overall cap. And so the desegregation amount that you guys have been seeing the last few years, that is the amount. You're not going to get more or less than that. That is the cap. That is where your district has been capped. It will be that number until there's some other type of legislative change. But then once you receive that funding, then yes, you make the determination on where to allocate that funding. And it's supposed to be in line with complying with whatever the order was that was put into place for the district.
I just asked if it is like a black box to me, and future can be.
Yes, you can actually add that on as a future topic. Make sure you go through that one.
Do all schools get it? Or is it
No,
the ones that get it?
19. There are 19 districts who have a current desegregation order and are receiving desegregation funding. So there's you guys, there's Phoenix Union. I'm not going to ramble off all 19 because then I'll fail that test, but I'm thinking like Holbrook. Agua Fria gets a tiny bit, I think. I wouldn't get you the whole 19, but yeah, 19 on the list for desegregation. All right, now we're going to talk about what happens when the money actually gets over here to the district. How do you figure out what to do with it? What's the best way to figure out what to do with it? And so the first thing I have for you is to look at these different pots of money that are going to be sent to the school district and just tell you what your options are when you do receive this funding. So first thing being the revenue control limit. Again, everything about the design of the revenue control limit was always that this is going to be for maintenance and operations. And in fact, in the old years, there used to be a lot of strict controls about things staying in their bucket. They started loosening those a little bit prior to the Great Recession. And then once the Great Recession happened and nobody had more than 2 nickels to rub together, they said, stop complaining, you can spend your 2 nickels however you want. And they completely opened up the floodgates on a lot of our flexibility. So those rules went into place during the Great Recession, and they haven't changed. So they've left. There were some that had temporary things on them, and those expired. But for the most part, a lot of the flexibility that was given during the Great Recession still exists in our funding formulas today. So when we look at revenue control limit, designed for M&O, but you have complete discretion to move that between M&O or capital. Let's say if tomorrow you guys are like, hey, we want to build a new school and we don't really need to pay people anymore. Put all that money into capital. You could make that decision. There are such things as recall elections in Arizona, but I mean, you could do something like that. You could move all of your M&O over to capital and just don't ask me to come over on that night. All right, so district additional assistance, same flexibility. You got the choice between moving it between M&O and capital. And it was mostly designed to be your capital funding, right? That's that capital amount we give per student, but you have complete flexibility on how you decide to move that between M&O and capital when the money's being sent to you. Same with your desegregation funding. You can move that back and forth. Prop 123, which was the settlement to the inflation lawsuit, went out to the voters, and it's going to be getting talked about a lot more in the next couple of years. But we have a Prop 123 add-on, that add-on amount, that 75 million add-on that went out statewide, that can be moved back and forth between M&O and capital as well. But then you have some things that are still dedicated. Your M&O override has to stay in M&O. Your capital override has to stay in capital, and your bond funds have to stay in bond. That is just talking about the revenue. We're going to get into expense and some of the creativity you can do on expense, but on the revenue piece of it, the revenues have to be assigned this way. And then this one is how you guys are assigning your funds right now. So right now you guys have your revenue control limit all being dedicated to M&O. Your capital funding for the last several years has all been dedicated to M&O. Your desegregation, almost in its entirety, dedicated to M&O, but you do have 50,000 that's going towards capital. I talked with Mike about that one already, so maybe that'll change here in a short future. Prop 123 add-on, that's going all to M&O. And then the other three, of course, are already dedicated into their streamlines. But what you can see is that there's already been a conscious effort by the district over the last few years to put a lot of the resources into M&O in regards to the revenues coming in. All right, we're gonna talk about expenses now. This is where it's gonna get real creative. At any point in time, feel free, raise a hand, ask a question, tell me to clarify. We're gonna talk about, now that you put money into these buckets, how do you decide what gets paid for out of the buckets, right? So you have people, you have furniture, technology, equipment, you have your curriculum, you have all of your facility stuff, like there's a water heater picture, right, that looks like really fun to go fund. All right, so we can get into those categories when you're coding expenses. Your people, they can come out of M&O, they can also come out of federal funds, and they can come out of capital and bond. There's some limitations on the people that can come out of capital and bond. They have to be associated with that work. Furniture, technology, and equipment typically comes out of capital, but it can also come out of bond. There are some limitations on how much furniture, technology, and equipment you can push towards bond based on how you're structuring your bond, but they can come out of bond. And in some cases, you can even get some of that stuff written into a federal grant, depending on the nature of the grant. Building maintenance. I always encourage everybody to go after every BRG. That is a building renewal grant that you can possibly get your hands on. That is extra money. That is the first place you go when you have a capital issue. But you can also take care of your building maintenance out of capital funds, sometimes out of federal funds. We saw with the ESSER, but they specifically said, we believe in ionization. If you guys want to do some ionization with your HVAC, by all means, use ESSER funds for that, right? That was one of the items they promoted. So sometimes federal funds, and then also bond. Bond is usually a good source for taking care of any building maintenance things you have.
Back to people.
People.
Who can you pay with a bond? What people?
So when you have a bond, you're going to go build something. Somebody's in charge of building that for you. You're going to have a facilities director. You might have a purchasing person who spends some of their time working on doing the POs for all of the GCs, subcontractors, and everybody else you're bringing in. Anybody who's doing work associated with that cost, their salary can be coded over to the bond.
We gotta get the kids to build the buildings, the teachers with the bond.
No, it's going to get more creative than that. You just got to, don't look ahead. In a few more slides, you're going to see some things. All right, curriculum comes out of your capital funds. Sometimes you can get it written into a federal grant. Buses, capital funds. There's a very good federal grant to go after right now. If you guys want some electric buses, that thing pays. I just helped out. An electrical bus costs over $400,000. They are getting 3 of them at $70,000 each. That is less than half the price of a diesel bus. On infrastructure, they're only out of pocket $3 grand to get 3 charging stations for their electric buses. So Federal, that clean school bus program, that one's pretty good. You can also pay for your buses out of bond. Your white fleet, that can come out of capital, depending on your attorney. I believe you guys use Gus Rosenfeld, so I'm going to tell you it can't come out of bond. Don't change your attorney just because you don't like what the attorney says. There's some districts that do that. It never looks good. Gus Rosenfeld's white fleet, not out of bond. Federal funds can sometimes also cover your white fleet, but again, with federal funds, it's all about what did you get written in the grant? Why are you doing it? Let's say you're getting an electric van that's transport McKinney-Vento, and you got a grant that said that they were going to cover that because that's the direction the feds are moving right now, then yes, you could do it. But only do the things that you actually got approved in your federal grant. Now, here's some tricky things about using federal funds. Federal money is great. When it came out with ESSER, I was like, everybody be careful about how you're spending your ESSER funds. When you spend federal funds on any type of construction activities, some of these other things, federal funds have additional requirements. You have to follow the additional requirements that come along with federal funds. One of those is Davis-Bacon wages. Davis-Bacon wages basically means that you have to ensure, let's say if you're bringing on a contractor, that contractor is paying the prevailing wage of the area, right? You can't bring in a contractor and paying everybody minimum wage, right? There's gonna be a federal violation for that. They have to pay the prevailing wages. They also don't like all of our creativity on procurement here in Arizona. They want these things hard bid. So just go out, get 3 hard bids. They'll have additional grant requirements that they write into it. They have infinite amount of reporting that they've been writing into ESSER. And then if it's people, you got to do a time and effort log. So if you have your people and it's like, well, half the time you're going to work out of the federal funds, but the other half of the time we're going to pay you out of M&O, well, you got to do a time and effort log that shows that is how they're working. They are actually dividing their hours up that way. All right. Now we're going to get into crazy creativity parts. By all means, stop me to walk through any of them in any more detail. Let's start it off easy. Let's see your revenue control limit. You get 30 million for that. You're going to put the whole 30 in M&O. Your capital, let's say you get 3 million for that. You put the whole thing in the capital. And when your expenses come in, you got 30 million of expenses. Those go to M&O, make that to 0. You get 3 million of capital expenses, makes that to 0. Nice little easy balance right there, right? All right, but now you want to do a 10% increase for all employees. So now you have this extra 3 million you're trying to code to M&O, but M&O only has 30 million. Yeah, the 3 million of capital expenditures going to capital. Where are you going to come up with 3 million? Here's some options. One, you pass a bond. And now you put a 3 million of bond into a little bond bucket. You take the 3 million you had in capital, you push that over into M&O, combined with the 30 that was already in there. Now you have 33 million in M&O. You have 3 million sitting in bond. That's your revenue. When you go to your expenses at that point, you take your 3 million of capital expenses, you code those out of bond, and you have 33 million in M&O now. So now you can code 3 million of expenses to M&O. A lot of that you guys have already done over the last few years, right? That's moving revenue around so you have revenue in the right buckets to match what your plan is. A lot of that is already in your system now. So let's go through another scenario where you've already done all that. The 3 million you guys have going to capital, that is your capital override. That will stay in capital, right? So we're not going to move that 3 million around. But now let's say you have the same situation where you're trying to come up with another 3 million to use towards M&O. This is where you get into having fun with the coding. So you take your 30 million that you have coded as an M&O expense, and you change that into a way where 27 million is being coded as M&O, but 3 million is being coded as capital. And I'm going to show you in a second how you do that. And then now you had that 30 million in M&O. Okay, you can afford 3 million of new spend now because you took away some of the money you were currently spending out of M&O and you pushed it over into capital. And then you have the 3 million that's going to bond then. That's the new 3 million of capital spending you just pulled out of the M&O expenditures. And then your other 3 million sitting there. Right before I get to questions, I'm going to explain that a little bit more. That happens through capitalizing your expenses. right? So we're going to talk about how do you capitalize expenses. There are certain things that have to be paid for out of maintenance and operations. If you say you want to paint this boardroom, that's an M&O expense. If you say you need to make some minor repairs to this boardroom, that's an M&O expense. If you say you're going to do all that stuff, maybe even you don't like this carpet tile anymore, you want to do some carpet, and you want to bundle that all up into one renovation project, well, now that's capital. And so now everything you were spending on M&O, doing all of these different things, M&O is not being spent on that anymore because now you've just capitalized everything. Capital is taking care of that need, right? So one way to do it is to bundle up expenses until they become capitalized, right? You take a bunch of little things that are being paid for out of M&O, you combine them into one big thing, and you make that thing now a capital project. All right, sometimes it's a split. So you go out and buy something, let's say you go buy a vehicle, right? You buy a vehicle, you get a vehicle and you're like, okay, yeah, I bought the vehicle, that is a capital expense. But after having the vehicle, you're like, you know what, I would really like a maintenance agreement. Well, can you guys take care of maintenance for me? How much you guys want to pay you on a maintenance agreement to take care of this vehicle for me? Well, that maintenance agreement is M&O. But if you tell them up front, when I purchase this vehicle from you, I need a 5-year warranty that includes all maintenance items. Every oil change, every tire change, like I want you guys to throw everything, the whole thing in it, and then give me the price of the vehicle. The whole thing is now capitalized because you've added it all into the original capital purchase, the whole thing has become capitalized. Don't worry, I've gone through some of this with Mike already, and so we're gonna be helping him do some of this stuff, so you're not gonna be doing this on the fly. But some other things that you can do is sometimes invest in capital expenditures that will reduce your M&O costs. So the first one I have up here, like let's say solar energy, right? You do a solar project. A lot of districts, especially when this first started happening, did solar projects on what's referred to as a power purchase agreement, where basically the solar panels, you don't actually own the solar panels, somebody else owns the solar panels. You're agreeing to pay them a price per kilowatt for each kilowatt the solar panel generates. And the idea is the price you're paying them is less than what you would have paid SRP or APS for that same kilowatt of energy. And maybe that little delta right there is like a penny a kilowatt, right? You're like, yes, but we're doing solar, we're being green, and we're making a penny every kilowatt. What's better than making a penny every kilowatt would be making 13 cents every kilowatt, because if you pay for that whole project up front, you've paid for that out of capital, all of the savings is a savings to M&O. And there's actually been some some recent developments. I'm presenting on it at spring conference, Mike, if you make it out. With solar now, where we can take direct credits as a school district. We don't have to go through a third party anymore. The feds are offering us direct credits on a lot of these projects now. New vehicles, they're usually more fuel efficient. You can get them with warranties that can free up M&O. At Tolleson, we're actually in an arrangement with Enterprise Rental Car. They help manage our white fleet, and we turn over vehicles pretty often. So if you guys ever see a Tolleson vehicle, God dang, everything in your guys' fleet looks brand new. It is. I have a plan with all of that. So we're going through brand new vehicles. It frees up M&O to keep cycling out vehicles a little bit more frequently. Your energy management system, the strength of your energy management system can help drive a lot of reduced M&O expenditures because they can identify things for you. They can identify when you have a water leak. They can identify when your people are not setting things to unoccupied mode over the weekends or over the breaks, right? So your energy management system can help you reduce your M&O costs. Those are just a few examples, but there's a lot of different ways where you could spend your capital money in a way with the goal of reducing your M&O expenses. And one thing I forgot to point out on this one, painting, repairs, construction supplies, when you're doing that in-house, even if you have like the best staff in the world, all of that is coming out of M&O, right? So if you have a painter and he is like, I mean, he could paint the Mona Lisa on the side of this building if you need it to him, that's fine, but all of his costs are going to come out of M&O, as opposed to if you contracted it out, that's all capital, right? So this even applies to whether you're contracting out these tasks or you're doing these tasks in-house, that's M&O that's being spent versus capital that could be spent for that same need instead. All right, before I go through the budget timeline, questions on the capitalization process, and you don't have to grasp it 100%, Mike does. So Mike I'll have, you know, in his free time when he's running around, I have people helping him out. We got Ken Hicks coming over here and some others coming over to help Mike out so we can start capitalizing some of your guys' expenses.
But M&O and capital, those are the two that are interchangeable, right?
Those are your main two buckets. It's not so much that that they're interchangeable, but when you look at bond, so, and I know we're gonna get deeper into bond next time.
Only capital.
It's only capital.
Be paid with bonds, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So you look
That's
at,
what matters.
so you look at bond, right? Bond is your best opportunity to generate additional revenue for the district, but it can only be used for capital.
Okay, got it.
So in order to have more availability to spend M&O on salaries, staffing, whatever, you have to push things towards being capitalized. So that way it's coming out of that bond and freeing up M&O to go use for other things that you'd like to use M&O on. So, because M&O is capped on the total of revenue, you're going to be able to push that way. Bond, though, bond is completely under a district's control. All right, so let's talk about the budget timeline. Now, this is not the timeline for coming up with your budget plans, deciding what you want to do on raises, right? That thing's really accelerated. Contracts go out in like February now. Everybody's like racing. I don't know who took the checkered flag this year, but this is the timeline for when documents are going to be coming to you guys. So we have a proposed budget that has to be done by July 5th. Most districts take it in June. They like to enjoy summer vacation. Hopefully, whenever the state can get their job done in time so we can get our job done faster. But the deadline is July 5th, right? It has to be done by July 5th. You guys have to propose a budget. By July 15th, you guys have to adopt the budget. Now, a couple of things here. There has to be 10 days between the two. So I've had even my own board and board secretary come back to me before and be like, okay, well, can we do a meeting this Tuesday and then another meeting next Tuesday? Because after that, everybody wants to go. And I'm like, no, that's 7 days. I need 10. You know, we're going to do like Friday. Nobody wants to do a meeting on a Friday. Oh, never mind. We're doing a meeting on Friday. You got to get 10 days in between the two meetings. July 5th, July 15th, there has to be at least 10 days. The other thing with proposed and adopted, you can't go up, right? That proposed budget is critical because you can't go up anymore. You can go down, right? If you heard feedback from the community, you're like, we need to reduce the budget when we adopt. You can go down, can't go up. Whatever you've calculated for your overrides, anything else like that, I think that's really the area where I've seen districts get in the most trouble. I've had to backfill for someone before. The district lost $3.5 million because, I don't know, they had trouble with the calculator. They weren't calculating the override out at the right amount. After you put the override in the proposed budget, that has to stay for the adopted budget, and that gets used for tax calculation. And after tax rates are set, that is it. You cannot change the override anymore. So you can go down, you can't go up. That's why the proposed budget is one of the more critical budgets. December 15th, the state will let you know if you're required to do a revision. I always recommend that it's best practice to do a revision every December 15th, especially because of the fact that we are now on current year student counts, and there is no way you knew exactly how many kids were going to be here come July. So it's fluctuating completely throughout the year. It's good to come December 15th and just do a check-in and tweak and update what you need to. May 15th is the final budget revision. Now, I'm going to say the term final loosely because we have statutes that allow us to go back up to 3 years and edit budgets. There's really only one thing that is final about May 15th, and that is your allocation between M&O and capital. So your district additional assistance, let's say come May 15th, for whatever reason, you push that allocation over to capital. Come May 16th, you're like, wait, we changed our mind. We want that back in M&O. You're stuck. That money rolls over in capital, right? So that's the most important thing about May 15th.
So,
That, and we got to deal with audits based on our May 15th budget.
so since we have a bond, do we want as much in M&O by
Yes.
May 15th as possible?
Which the revenue wise, you guys are already pretty much there. There's only a few other tweaks Mike and I have already talked about the few tweaks that you guys can do to push a little bit more towards M&O. And the biggest adjustment really is going to be your ESSER funds. Ken's working with Mike. We're looking at moving some of that around to free up some more M&O. But that's what you want done by May 15th. The expenses and the capitalizing, that's going to be more of an ongoing project. That's not something that we can do quickly with a few journal entries. That is like an actual active project to get that mindset in.
But then does that mean like on May 15th, so we moved everything from capital to
Over to
M&O.
M&O.
So now there's nothing in capital until we have access to bond funds.
Or until the next year starts and you have the ability to move everything back into capital again if you want to with all your new money.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to show you guys where you see this. So Mike's going to keep bringing you this big old, it's not too big. It's like 10 pages, 11 pages, 12 pages. But he's going to bring you the budget, right? And so on the budget, the most important pages to look at where you would see, well, what are we doing with our money, Mike? Page 7 has a lot of the important detail on it. You can see your allocations. And so what you see on the far left column with numbers is like, this is the total money coming in. And the next column, this is how much of that money got put into M&O. And then the next column is, this is how much of that money got put into capital. And you can see the only thing getting put into capital is the capital override. Okay. The other thing you can see on these budget forms, on the bottom of page 7 and the bottom of page 8, you're going to see the total amount available to spend out of the two buckets, M&O and capital. So you can see the M&O right there in the top half where it shows the 56 million available to spend out of M&O, and that on this page, 3,050,000 are getting pushed over to capital. That 3,050,000, the 3 million is your capital override. The 50,000 is DSEG. But those getting pushed over to capital to where now you see on page 8, the total amount of money you have available to spend in capital is 5.4 million. So these carry budget balances from one year to the next. They don't revert. So that other, 2.4 million, that's a difference there. That's a budget balance that's been running forward from previous years. Another big page, truth in taxation. This lets you know if you've been required to put out a notice to let everybody know that you're doing a tax increase that requires a notice. More commonly when this is going to happen is when you're doing adjacent ways. So adjacent ways funding, again, is the one that only the board has to vote on. That's why they want to make sure you notify the public. It doesn't go out for a public vote. It is literally like when the board says, yes, we need adjacent ways, the board has spoken, therefore it's on the tax rate. You guys say we need $10 million in adjacent ways, 10 million goes directly on a tax rate. They pay for the 10 million right that year, the moment you guys said that you needed it. And so because of that, that's why they require you to put out a notice to tell everyone. So even if you did this, if you did 1 year you do 2 million and the next year you do 1 million, right, in adjacent ways. Even in the year that you do 1 million, you have to tell everybody this is how much it costs for us to do 1 million and compare that to 0, right? Not compare it to the fact you did 2 million the year before, compare it to 0 because you had an option to go to 0. And so that's the way all of that is structured, is you're telling them it's a tax increase, even though when you sit them down and explain to them, like, actually this is a tax decrease. We took 2 million last year. 1 is less than 2. You still have to present it as a tax increase when you put out the documents in the newspaper and everything. All right, so that's truth and taxation. Those are the main little pages to touch on when you guys get those budget files during that budget timeline. All right, some other key dates, March 1st. Seeing that you guys are all still sitting here, I can only imagine that you cannot talk enough about aggregate expenditures. So we will be beating that dead horse again next year, all the way up until March 1st. And I have great news for you. Next year, we get to do it for an extra day because it's a leap year. So we can go all the way up to February 29th talking about aggregate expenditures next year. The other thing you'll get, because then by March 1st, it'll be done. Everybody will need a new topic. You get a new topic. It's called the Classroom Spending Report. That gets released at the beginning of March, where everybody can see how they're spending their money and do those comparisons. And the big report that a lot of things get based on is that annual financial report that comes to you on October 15th. That is a recap of how you spent money the prior year. That gets used in a lot of different ways. All right, the superintendent does an annual financial report. Our general's office does stuff with it. Like that data right there, that data set is being used in a lot of different ways based on what gets back to you on October 15th. All right, this one isn't doing with the funding formula anymore. I'm gonna move into just a couple of big topics real quick. Just looking at when you're considering how to plan big for Phoenix Elementary School District 1, things you guys got to keep your eyes on. One is you did a demographic study a few years ago, right, with applied economics. Rick Burner, big guy. I've worked with him for a number of years. And Rick brought you back this data. This was lifted straight from that report, showing what's been happening with the average daily membership in Phoenix Elementary, right? You take this back even further, you can see some of that trend. And so when you get to the last line, and I hate it when people use double Y axes, I have to give Rick my feedback on that. So ignore the red line that's going all like somebody's having a heart attack looking at the numbers, and just really focus on the blue bars. And you can kind of see where the blue bars have been going down pretty gradually over the last couple of decades. He gave you some reasoning in there. So this is also lifted from that report. At the time when this report was conducted in 2020, you had over 2,500 students that were going to neighboring charters that are right here in your boundary. So that's where a lot of the student loss is coming from. We also know that low birth rates have been cycling their way through. But this is where a lot of the losses is all these charter schools that are popping up. That's not unique to Phoenix Elementary. That is a common trend throughout the inner city right now. Glendale Elementary has closed 5 schools. Isaac has been identified as the highest financial risk district. We have a lot of issues right now in the inner city because that is where the charters are popping up. It's nice and convenient when you have a whole bunch of kids to have access to real quickly after opening your charter school. So I don't want you guys to take that as you're doing anything wrong, but that is the nature of the beast of what we're dealing with right now. All right, so when you look at even just going back to 2010, 2011, 11, 12, in those years, the number I want you to focus on is basically all the way down to the right, all the way off to the right, where Rick does some capture rate type scenarios for you of how many you're capturing. And you can see that was in the 90s, so that was doing good back in those years in terms of the number of students that were out there and being generated. That's not bad. But then he had you dropping down and projecting into the 70s. For this current year, 22, 23, he had you projected to drop down to 5,605. And you actually went down to 4,699 based on your last report is where you're at. So in the last 15 years, you have declined by 2,806 students. That's a handful of schools that you've declined by since 2008. And then there's the impact on the weighted count. Your teacher experience that we talked about earlier, you guys were really close back then to getting extra money, to starting to generate extra money, right? You were at 0.9948. You were like right there knocking on the door for more money for teacher experience. But now your teacher experience has declined. It's at 0.9781. Doesn't look like a huge decline, but when you're in a district of this size, it's hard to make up those extra years to get that bump over now. And you can see your revenue control limit in terms of total money coming to you from the main per pupil formula. You actually get less total money today, even after 20 by 2020, all of these other increases, you are getting less money today than the money you had back in 2008. And that's because in 2008, you had more students and you don't have as many students today. So despite all those increases to the base level, despite these new group B weights we've got, you have less money today than you did back in 2008 because the student count has gone down. And that's a function of the formula. I'm not going anywhere with that. I'll just put it out there and let you guys know this is something that you need to start developing a plan for how you respond to this situation. All right. Now that I've depressed everyone, let me go ahead and do some key takeaways. Some key takeaways to remember from the presentation is that the per pupil formula, that gets set by statute, right? So, usually when I point to downtown, it's like an actual distance, but for you guys, it's like, you walk over there, those people that you walk over next to, they're setting that for you. Most of the opportunities to increase funding actually come from local property tax. So everything like bonds, adjacent ways, all of that, you can get all the extra funding you want. It's going to come off of a local property tax. With some districts I work with, they're like, we don't want to do anything with property tax. Like, we need to keep property tax exactly where it's at. But we need all this money because we're trying to build a school or we're trying to do this. And I'm like, you're saying a couple of things that that doesn't connect. Like, if you want more money, then it takes more taxes. That's kind of the nature of how the system is set up. Federal funds equals federal requirements. So whenever you get that extra federal money, it's great. Just make sure you're compliant with all the extra rules they give you. I didn't go over anything addressed with any types of other efficiencies that would go in there. The main thing that I did focus on with yours was the capitalizing. So when I look over your books and I see how expenses were coded and what expenses you have, the biggest opportunity I see is for capitalizing expenses. You could do that to the tune of a handful of millions, and I've talked with Mike about that. So we got to look at starting to capitalize expenses. And then most importantly, right, any Covey fans, you start with the end in mind. If you can start with thinking about where you want to be, where do you want to be as a district? What is the goal? You can always come up with a path to get there, right? If I know where I want to go have dinner tonight, it's as easy as pulling out my cell phone and asking Google how to get there. Now, if I want to go have dinner in California, well, that's possible. I just got to be ready to make that trip, right? So it's a matter of just knowing where you want to go. Once you know where you want to go, it's easy enough to chart a path to get there. All right, and the last insights I have for you is board, superintendent, CFO, that alignment, that makes everything work. If everybody is going towards the same goal and trying to do everything to get to that goal, and you guys are all aligned right here at this table, you guys will get there. That'll happen quickly. I'd like to use Tolleson as an example. When I got there, there was a handful of things where they're like, we've been trying to do these things. We haven't been able to do them forever. Our teachers aren't paid well. We can't even build a road out to 99th Avenue from our bus yard. I was like, all right. I was like, well, we're taking all that. They're like, we built a school. They never got a performing arts center. We've been promising them one for a decade. I'm like, all that can happen. I go, here's what I need you guys to do. So every time I bring you something that has to do with the tax rate, you just say yes. We'll make all that happen. They've said yes every time. We've given good raises every time. All right, communication equals success. You can't be in alignment if you guys aren't communicating well. So communication, make sure you guys are all on the same page. Everybody knows what the plan is. They're following the plan. But plans change. Your plans can change, but don't worry, your coding can too. So right now, if the plans consisted of things that require a lot of maintenance and operations, but then all of a sudden it's like, no, actually now, no, we want to level the tax rate, but we still have all these capital needs. Okay, you can adjust coding. You can react to that. You could start to make that change with how you're doing your money as well. And most importantly about our formula, I didn't go into tax rates and all that stuff in too much depth. But budget capacity outweighs cash. So the way it works in Arizona, if you have $100 of budget capacity and you have $1,000 in cash, you can spend $100. If you have $100 of budget capacity and you have $2 of cash, you can spend $100. The cash does not control your spending. The budget capacity controls your spending. There are mechanisms in place to generate cash when the cash is insufficient to meet the budget capacity. I'm working with one district right now. It's a big issue because the discrepancy between their cash and their budget capacity. It's a small district. Their annual revenues are like $4 million, and the discrepancy between their cash and their budget capacity is $7.5 million. And I'm like, and it's accumulated over 15 years. And I'm like, how did you guys not address this like 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago? And then now counting things, I'm the bad guy because I'm the one who has to tell them what was being done wrong for so long. But there is a mechanism in place, so you can tax for cash deficits. There are always different mechanisms to get the cash to match the budget capacity. But there aren't that many mechanisms to make budget capacity match the cash, right? I won't say none because I know a couple, but most part budget capacity. When Mike says this is our budget balance, that's the amount of money you have to spend. You don't have to worry about whatever cash is there. That's Mike's job to make sure that the cash gets. I'm sure that's plenty of overload for a Friday afternoon, but if you have more questions, feel free to fire away. If you're like, I would need another study session for the questions I got, feel free to let Mike know. He'll tell me when I need to come back for something else.
Well, I know you're already coming back. We have our
Yep.
next thing, so I don't want to ask questions that would spend time on, so we focus on other stuff. But is it possible to get a copy of this, like printed out for notes and stuff? Because I a lot, but there's just like the acronym.
Absolutely. Copy of the slides.
I actually just sent you an email to make sure that we keep it as part of our minutes.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yep.
So I just sent an email and so she will be able to do that and we'll get it.
Just so for the,
That'll work.
I'll make sure you
ask for like the acronyms and stuff, just because it can be helpful. I'm not the educator around here, so I don't speak acronym language.
Well, and when you get those budget forms, they're going to have those acronyms in there. They're not going to spell it all out. It's just going to have the acronyms in there. And when you look up any reports on Department of Ed's website, they're also just using the acronyms. So they're like, we have full transparency if you can understand what these acronyms mean. There you go. That's right.
Thank you. It was very. Especially helping me understand the people formula, like if I understand that part at least. And I am just very fortunate they said funding, and then also it would help is having like fractional budget.
Yeah.
Example, and like give an example of like, I don't know, something assessors must go through that and find stuff. Because I did like how you presented that page 7.
Yeah.
Keeping that in mind and days like just don't have to be aware of like what's coming around the corner. So thank you.
Absolutely.
And having that and just like students, it's like, okay, we're gonna go through some part of this, and I think that helps because yeah, we receive it and it's there. I'm like, just like,
yeah,
that person is thinking of math and it's confused.
Yeah, I go cross-eyed really quick. I'm kind of nervous to ask questions or learn more about taxes, since it just seems like that's like a place to kind of.
Absolutely. So there's several ways that you increase taxes to be able to have more funding for the school district. Some of them you guys are already doing. So you have your overrides, you have your bond. On your overrides, the capital override is not maxed out yet. So if you're looking at where are the opportunities on your capital override, the interesting thing about capital overrides is you can actually stack them. So you can stack or you can replace. The one district who was like notorious for stacking 2 or 3 overrides just because that was their strategy. Gilbert used to do it all the time. They would stack 2 or 3 because they're like, well, if our voters see a big number, they're going to say no. But if each year we do a smaller number and then they start to stack over each other and overlap and they have different expirations, like that was their thing. They always did that. So you get to either stack capital overrides or just do them as a replacement. So you have a 3 million. Your revenue control limit right now, I think, is about 50. You can push that up to a 5. That would give you another 2 million in capital override. Adjacent ways, you can always tax for adjacent ways. With adjacent ways, there's limitations on how that money can be spent. It's all about safe egress and ingress into the property. That's going to be your bus lanes, your fire lanes, pulling utility into the property when you have newer properties, those types of things. So it's limited on how it can be used, but it only takes a board vote because it's a safety item. They only wanted it to have a board vote where the board can say, no, we need to redo the bus lane. Like the bus is shaking over all these potholes. We're going to redo the bus lane. Put that on adjacent ways. Let's redo the bus lane. Or you're like, you know what? I don't like where they're picking up the special education students. We need a new bus lane that is just for special education. Put it on adjacent ways. We're going to go pay for that special education bus lane right now, right? So adjacent ways, it's just a board vote. It has to be done with the proposed budget, but it's a board vote, and then it goes straight to the tax rate after the board votes on it.
Is that common?
Adjacent ways, yes. Adjacent ways happens all the time. What The only thing that has made it drop off a little bit from where it was historically was that they changed the review process for adjacent ways. We had one district, incidentally a district we were talking about earlier, who took a little bit of advantage of adjacent ways and used it to make lease payments, which was not the intent of adjacent ways. And so because of that, a bill came forward, Representative Dial, who was struggling at the time and needed something to put in his hat, went ahead and passed a bill to change adjacent ways to go to the School Facilities Board, their old name. And so now they get reviewed by the School Facilities Board. It's still a local property tax, but the School Facilities Board is reviewing all adjacent ways projects that are more than 50,000. But yes, a lot of districts use it. It's easier now than it was maybe 7 years ago. There's a couple of directors who got really nitpicky. And they're like, oh, you need to build the road? I agree, you need to build the road. Oh, you got to do retention for the road? Nope, the retention doesn't count. It's like, you can't have the road without having some retention. What do you mean the retention doesn't count? So they got real picky. And the last couple of administrations, though, they're back to being flexible. So your contractors, when you do projects, usually identify, they'll say, this is the amount that we believe is eligible for adjacent ways. They will put that on their responses to you when you're going through a contract. Yeah. And it rolls. So for me, like my strategy on adjacent ways, tax for more than what you need because it rolls. And you don't have to do the truth in taxation notice if you're just using leftover cash from a prior year. It's only when you run out of adjacent ways cash, now you have to go out to the voters and say, hey, we're about to tax you guys for adjacent ways, right? So you want to tax it and then let it sit until you need it. And then you just, once you notice you're about to spend it all out, and go do another tax and load it back up again. And then bonds is the big one. Bonds, and I don't want to steal a lot of thunder from the next presentation, but bonds is going to be your biggest opportunity to bring in more funding. And then it's about doing the strategies to make sure you're freeing up funding where you want to be able to spend it. So bond will be the one that gives you the most bang for the buck.
You've only been around for an eminent override and then a bond this past one. So I don't know about this capital override. I don't think I've looked into that. So today's a lot. So.
Well, on anything, if you guys ever need more detail, I mean, you always have Mike, but if you guys ever need another presentation or anything, you feel free to let me know. I'm always right down the street.
The new name for the SOFB is?
School Facilities Division. So Callie has taken over. Callie was Hoffman's chief of staff when she was at Department of Ed, and then she went off before Hoffman did. She left a little early. But now Callie well, she's married now. It's Callie Tyler. Yeah. So Callie is now over the School Facilities Division. They fall under ADOA. Historically, I've always found, I mean, I had to deal with her in a different context, but Callie has always seemed easy to work with to me. And Jack Smith, who was there before, was easy to work with too. So they've been easier to work with lately. Yeah, and those building renewal grants, always go after building renewal grants.
I wrote that down.
So a building renewal grant essentially is anything that is needed to keep you above minimum adequacy guidelines. So let's say HVAC, you got to have, we can maybe even do it with a little bit more air conditioning up in here, but we got to have air conditioning. So HVAC is definitely minimum adequacy guidelines. You can go out for HVAC. So if you have units that have outlived their useful life, failure's imminent, go get a building renewal grant. They'll replace it for you. Or if a unit just failed, is just tanked out on you, hurry up and get a building renewal grant. They will pay for it for you. You should not be rushing to spend your own capital to pay for a unit that just failed. That's like an easy phone call qualification. Roofing, you can get your roofing done. If you don't like the paint on the outside of some of your buildings, where you're like, man, it just looks old when you look at the school. What you do is you get a Ryland tube, right? And you put it next to the building, and it shows how fast water is seeping into the wall. And then that's called weatherization, and they paint the whole building for you for free. So they'll cover all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of stuff that is minimum adequacy guidelines. You can go get building renewal grants for that, and that's a lot of extra money. In Tolleson, we probably bring in $2 to $3 million just through building renewal grants. That's extra state money. that's covering your projects for you.
I don't even know if there's any other questions to ask.
All right. I know it's a ton. If you have follow-ups, you guys know how to get them to superintendent, and she will channel it out to me and Mike, and we will be happy to address those.
Board members, there's a question and an answer question, so we can use that one.
That would be nice. Having like a little 2x2, 3x3 of like understandable budget buckets. It's normal like a whole page of stuff, but for questions.
Call them cheat sheets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If then,
So a lot of attorneys that work, this district has done historically over the last few years. It's only been the last month or so. Capitalizing some pieces. So we're doing this, talking about so that we're just so, and that's probably like a 2-year process. Some jobs, some contracts put in place, change things for renovation. But that's like, we're in contracts now. So it's the time of flourish as well.
some things are gonna go faster than others. But there are some.
Yeah, like on some of those, it could be that historically you've always contracted out paint repairs, some drywall repairs. And then it's just, okay, now next year, when you see those POs come across and you see that it's about to get billed to M&O, you're like, nope, that needs to get packaged up into a renovation project so we can do it through capital. So it's like changing a mindset on it. The thing that's harder to disconnect from is on some of the stuff where it's in-house staff that's been doing the work. Because then you're going to be trying to explain to them like, no, we're actually going to contract that out. They're like, but I do a better job and I do it for less. And it's like, we know you can, but just trust me, it makes more sense if we contract this out because you're M&O and that's capital and we want to use the capital. So there's some of those pieces that take over time. The reason why I brought in the demographic study is because, like Mike said, you know, the revenue piece, you guys have been doing a lot of the revenue piece already. There isn't a lot left to do on the revenue. And you get to capitalizing expenses. You'll have that mastered probably within a year or two. What's happened with your ADM and the efficiency use of your facilities is a much bigger topic, a much bigger issue, and a real thoughtful plan needs to be put together to discuss that. And that is really the piece that's going to take you to another level when that's brought under control. So I told Mike, whether it's me, somebody else, if you guys bring in anybody to help look at that, that is really the bigger piece of the puzzle that has to get addressed.
Absolutely, because we do need to have conversations around that, but fully understanding the picture of
Yeah.
like how we got here to be very transparent and communicative with the community, so we understand here's where we're at, how we got here, and then where do we all want to go, kind of a thing. So
Hopefully you can bring those couple of thousand students back from the charter schools and drive the charter schools out so we can start to turn the tide and put districts back in front instead of charters getting all the popularity lately. That'd be a good trend to see right here in District 1, start from right here in the city and expand that out to where the charters can't compete anymore. And remember, charters don't have access to bond funds. That's why the last couple of years at the legislature, they keep trying to attack our ability to access the tax base, because even though the formula gives them more dollars, they don't have access to bond funds. So any district could have access to twice as much money as a charter just by getting a bond authorized and then issuing it. So you can very quickly outprice the competition where you would offer facilities in an environment that they can't compete with.
I stress out doing my own taxes, so now to know like how important that decision is like as a district, just freaks me out. So,
Yeah.
I had a question. And I think it was about, what were we just talking about? The demographic study, I'm forgetting something.
I have a question about, so because we are in downtown, we have the access where the G-Plex typically get
Yeah.
applied to some of the developments happening in downtown. What can we use like those funds for?
So those funds just get used for the calculation of who's going to pay the tax. And essentially all a GIPLET is doing is replacing the fact that they're not paying a property tax. And so instead of paying a property tax, they're paying this excise tax to make up for that because they don't have assessed values. They're actually phasing out GIPLETs right now. They're going to start doing, not the current ones, but the new process going forward is going to be when the city wants to offer these deals, that there's going to be like a 6 to 8 year abatement from taxes. And then after that, you come on the property tax rolls. So that's kind of like the new direction that they're going with it, that they don't want to be doing GIPLETs anymore. But that cash is just cash. It doesn't come with budget capacity. So it's just replacing the cash that you would have got through property tax. Now, what is extra cash to spend? Yeah, so they already have the abatement in statute now. So that's going to be the new plan, is that new properties that are trying to do this, where they partner with, like, let's say the city or the county, and they create this GIPLET. Instead of doing that, they're just going to give them an abatement from property tax, and then after that, it's going to come on the property tax roll. So that's the new process. But the cash doesn't help you because it doesn't come with budget capacity. What does help is something that Kyrene Elementary District has done. They had 28 acres of land sitting right next to the I-10. When I was there, I bugged forever to leverage it. They didn't do it then, but they have done it recently. And they signed a deal for $100 million, 77 years lease. All of that money is spendable. So that's a lot of money coming into that district that is all spendable money. So that is really where opportunities are at. You're having more districts now who are looking at leasing out their facilities. Glendale, with the 5 schools they've closed, they're looking at the possibilities of doing long-term ground leases on some of those facilities. And so as this trend is happening, where charters have now, taken a couple 100,000 students out of the equation, and our facilities aren't as efficient, and people look towards closing. When they look towards closing, they're like, how do we turn that parcel into a revenue generator? And the way to do that is long-term ground lease. You'll get that residual income, and when you get to the end of the lease, which a lot of these have to go more than 50 years, so none of us will probably be alive by then, but when they get to the end of the lease, the property reverts back to the school district. So you hold on to the asset and you get revenue from the asset during that entire time. So that is extra money, but the GIPLETs aren't offering us extra money. The other thing that kind of hurts you, depends on how you want to look at it. A lot of the developers that come in, they're going to ask, do you mind being designated as a foreign trade zone? Right? So that's going to be the request you'll get from a lot of developers. And what that means is that they get reduced taxes because their assessed value gets knocked down to 5% assessment ratio. So they pay less taxes, and you have less bond capacity, and you receive less revenue from them because you let them be designated as a foreign trade zone. The reason why they ask for that, of course, for their benefit, is to get less taxes. What they try to sell you on is, if you let me come here, I bring jobs. So, we have a solar company trying to go up in the West Valley right now, and that's what they're trying to sell everybody on is, let me get foreign trade zone designation. I will bring jobs with me. And it's like, yeah, what are you paying for those jobs? $20 an hour, and you want us to be, the other warehouses are paying the same thing right now. But that's what you'll get a lot on development questions, is people wanting to be a foreign trade zone. I think it's already a ton for a Friday. You have to let it sink in.
So thank you so very much for, again, coming out to do this, being ready. I feel like this came at appreciate the availability to get here today and also do our next study session. So,
Absolutely.
anything you need us to prepare for being ready for that, anything, I mean, I like recommended reading. So that when I get there, I'm more able to kind of pay attention. I promise to keep looking into it.
No, if there's, if going into that meeting, there are any questions that any of the board members have, if you get that, the superintendent, how you got, and she'll send that over to me. And then I'll make sure that as a part of the presentation, I am addressing all those different questions and concerns. So, you know, because I'm going to take my own perspective on how in-depth you guys want to get. So I'm going to assume we don't want to talk about yields, coupons, and all those fun terms. And I'm going to think about, no, it's all about how it relates to the school district. But in the event that you guys are like, no, actually, no, we want to send that over to the superintendent. She will let me know. I'll be like, all right, let's have fun with it. All right. Well, thank you guys for having me.
I think, we do have a motion to adjourn our work study session at 12:13 p.m. Thank you. All in favor say aye. All opposed say nay. The ayes have it, the motion passes, and we will adjourn at 5:13 p.m. and see everybody April 11th. Tomorrow. Tomorrow at Market City, I'm sorry, 10:30. And then